am I ready to go? Like, go? Oh,
Hi, everyone. Today is Saturday, October 26th, and we are really, really excited to do the DARPA D class for you guys because this has been, I don't know. I mean, there are so many really, really funny D classes, but this has to be maybe one of the funnier ones that I've done. I think also for you as well, Mabo.
yeah.
So we're gonna start with her section, and then I have a small additional section to share with you guys afterwards as well. But Mabo, take it away.
Okay, let me get this pulled up. So if you know me, you know I love to make slides. So initially I wrote this out to challenge myself. And then Emily came in and said, oh, let's do a call. So then I got the opportunity to make slides. Let's get those pulled on up. Okay. So this is the DARPA D class. Hi, everyone. This is the DARPA D class, and it's called the Fully Baked Cupcake because you'll see in my description today how we got around to from a half-baked cupcake into the fully baked cupcake. So let's go ahead. If anybody has been following this DARPA story for a little while now, it first got introduced when I was looking into Emily's D class, I think how you say it, the Lemony, is that how you say it? Lemony D class on ISO being stellar. ISO is stellar. So when I was looking into that, I was like, oh man, there's something here that I need to find. I don't know what it is, but I need to keep searching this out. So I kept searching it out and searching it out. The first thing that I came to was that ISO 2022 was first created in 2004. So I was just looking and digging and trying to figure that out. And if you remember from Emily and Danielle's Nasara Jasara D class that they did, both of them were talking, and at different times they brought up 2004 again. So first actually Danielle talked about it from Sun Microsystems as that being a turning point. And then Emily talked about it as the Wagner Group was Invest founded in 2004. So I thought that was very strange. So ISO 2004 and then Invest and some microsystems. So I was like, okay, let me look up and see what else happened in 2004. So that was the little thread that got me started into looking into all of this in the first place. So as I looked it up, I found out that Facebook was also started in 2004. Google starts Gmail in 2004, and Basel 2 is implemented in 2004. And I'm like, oh man, that's a lot of things going on in 2004. So it just got my little bells tinging. There was also many other things, of course. George W. Bush was in office at that time. The Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act came out at that time as well. So there's many like geopolitical, technical things going on in 2004. So that was kind of the thing that started, and I made an initial post. My idea from this initial post was that the white hats, being sneaky sneaks that they are, actually went back to the future. And so that was my theory. Did they go back to the future and start something in 2004 to get things rolling, to get us on this timeline for what we're implementing now? So this idea that maybe they went back to 2004 and started implementing all these major things got me curious, and that's what got me started looking into that. So it was this idea that they were going back to the future to check things out. So from there, I wrote my theory, and Emily said, no, you need a little, you need to dig a little bit deeper. Go and check out Facebook, the origins of Facebook, and Adam Goldberg and the Campus Network. So me thinking I already knew things, it was early in the morning when I got that email. And so I said, oh, I remember from the Q days that the story goes that there's this life log, this guy, I can't, Chester Bell, Gordon Chester Bell, that created LifeLog, and he's the one that actually that DARPA stole the information from to get social media started, and they created Facebook off of LifeLog. So I wrote this whole post thinking that I was like really fancy and new stuff about Chester Bell creating LifeLog. And then Emily came back and was like, no, got the big no from Emily. And so what she was asking me to do was actually look into Adam Goldberg and the campus network and how that was connected to Facebook, as opposed to just my simple story from what I learned when I was following along on the cue boards. So that was my half-baked cupcake. I came back, didn't do any research, just threw out what I thought I knew. I even got some of my facts wrong because I was too excited, and I just like word vomited and I got the no. So this is, so Emily was asking for the Q1,144,000 view with my stellar glasses on, and I gave her the Q101. So now, oops, oh, I want to actually present. Oh no, there was a whole conversation. So in this conversation, I have to go back to this conversation. So in this conversation, Emily came back and said, no, you got your facts wrong. Zuckerberg was not at Columbia, which I had said in my original post. He was at Harvard, and he was not classmates with Goldberg. I am. So of course my alarm bells go off on that. She also goes into talking about how she knew Adam Goldberg from her days back in Columbia in what year? 2003, 2004. So there's that year again. And I knew Emily went to Columbia, but I didn't know she was at Columbia during that time. So here she is at Columbia with Adam Goldberg, who is the creator of what is called Campus Network. At the time it was there, it went through a few iterations, what I'll get to a little bit later. She was acquaintances and friends with him during that time. And that's what she wanted me to actually look into. So she had brought this idea about 2004 to Sarah Kim and asked him, when did the White Hats infiltrate DARPA? And he said, she asked if it was in 2004 or before. And he said, it was before 2004. As they like to be sneaky, they won't tell you. But trust me, it was before 2004. And then Emily says, ha ha ha, many years before or decades? And he says, many years ago. So a good non-answer answer or military answer to that. So anyways, from that, we were checking back, or Emily and I were going back and forth, and she said, well, they infiltrated DARPA, or the government, at least before 1963. We learned that in the, I think it was the Unicorn 5 or Unicorn 4D class with when she told us about JFK being a black hat. So it goes back to at least 1963 when the White Hats have infiltrated the US government, and maybe before then when they infiltrated the US military. So that is what has got us started on this. And so now I present, instead of my half-baked cupcake, I'm presenting my fully baked cupcake. So let's get a little bit started into DARPA. In order to understand when the Black Hats, or when the White Hats actually infiltrated the military and DARPA, we have to first understand the history of DARPA. So this little section is called ARPA, DARPA, ARPA, DARPA, ARPA, maybe. So DARPA has a bit of a identity crisis. From the very beginning, it wasn't quite sure if they were a national security agency that does science or a science agency that does national security. So all throughout its history, it's always gone through this kind of back and forth. Are they a scientist for national security or vice versa? So brief history of DARPA. And before I get into it, I just want to just say really briefly that my research into DARPA was all about the information revolution. There's so many departments and so many things, that a million different rabbit holes that you could go down. So I'm speaking specifically about the information revolution and not any of their other projects. I know that there's many different projects and they've had their fingers in many different things. So as we move forward, that's the lens through which I'm doing this presentation, because it goes back to that original question of Facebook and social media and their involvement in that particular time period. So the brief history of DARPA: Russians DARPA started in 1958. The Russians launched satellite Sputnik in 1957. And that was really shocking to the US because at that time, the US thought that they were like the military great. And to have Russia come in and launch a satellite into space, even though it was a satellite, it was still a major threat to the United States. It not only was it a surprise to them, it also made them look kind of bad because now the Russians were ahead of them in what they considered the space Star Wars or Space Wars. So 1958, they pulled together, they pulled this together very quickly after Sputnik. And in 1958, they launched the Advanced Research Projects Agency, also known as ARPA. And that was done by the Department of Defense, but commissioned by the Pentagon. So the very first project that they launched from after Sputnik was a project called Project Argus. And this is, it's kind of funny because their idea was they were worried about nuclear bombs being able to be projected towards the United States. So their idea, the DARPA's first project, the Project Argus, was to launch nuclear bombs up into space and have them detonate in space. And they were hoping that it would create a force field around the US so that if other bombs were to be launched, that they would fry before they got into the atmosphere. Now, that probably goes without saying that launching nuclear bombs to stop nuclear bombs didn't actually work, or that project failed. But they went on to a 60+ year prolific history of DARPA. So DARPA is a very interesting organization within the US military. They are known as the Mad Scientist Department of the US government, where future becomes now. They make science fiction come to life, and they're the most powerful, most productive science research agency in the entire world. So they have many interesting little tidbits about DARPA as an organization within the US military. But one of the interesting things is that it's one of the organizations that they have a freedom to fail. So scientists come in and they're able to work on projects even if they don't end up working, which is kind of different. A lot of different organizations have a requirement of success, so to speak, but in DARPA, they have this freedom to fail. So that allows for their ideas to maybe come to fruition, maybe not. Some other things that are interesting that will be important to recognize when we come back to this. There's a few things that I want you to keep in mind, because as you're thinking about the history and where the sneaky white hats could come into play, think about these little tidbits as we move forward. So it's a unique department in the United States government. It's awarded short contracts. This is a really important point. It's only 3 to 5 years of eminent scientists as directed project managers who in turn are given the freedom to fund research they believe will benefit the military. So sometimes they're directed, but also they have a freedom with the amount of research that they can do. It's a small department of only about 200 people, and they often hire outside contractors and work with universities as well. So in the US government, it's probably one of the smallest, if not the smallest departments there is. They're most famous for launching the information revolution, which I'm going to talk about today, including ARPANET, our internet, HARP, early AI, Tor, GPS, Siri, Boston Robotics, and much, much more. So they're really prolific in what they produce and has come out of their department for all their scientific tech. And I'm sure after today's ICO, we'll learn a lot more about that, even Emily's D class. But I want to talk about the ARPANET, because that's what is important with this information revolution and how it ties into where we're at today. So prior to 1960, they were working on the defense. But you have to realize that when ARPANET, or when ARPA started in the first place, they were post-Cold War. So by 1961, they had the deputy director, Jack Ruina. And one of the things, he was only there for a very short tenure, but one of the things that he was known for was the working towards disarmament from the nuclear war or from nuclear at all, because they had just gotten out of the atomic bomb, World War II, were in the Cold War, and there were two factions within the US government. One faction was, oh, we need bigger, better bombs, and the other faction was, no, we need to choose how to engage more wisely. So it wasn't that they were trying to disarm the military, it's just making wiser choices and wiser science on how to approach military action. So in the 1960s, they started working towards using what is called, they knew that there was an issue with if communication. So if there was, at that time, they were working with circuit board communication. And if one circuit went down, that would cut off communication to that area for good. So they were trying to figure out ways to get around that problem. And that's when they came up, or they started working with what was called packet switching, which was invented by Paul Barron of the RAND think tank. Small clusters of digital information broken up from larger messages for expedience sake. So that idea came prior to the 1960s, but it sat idle for a while until a guy named J.C. Licklider came along to ARPA in 1962. So Licklider is a very interesting character in this whole scenario. He becomes the director of Information Processing Techniques Office, the IPTO, in 1962. So Licklider was also of the camp of demilitarization from the Office of Command. So he changed his office, which was known as the Office of Command and Control, to the IPTO. So he went more from military into information. And that's kind of an important piece in all of this, as you'll see that back and forth in DARPA. Are they military or are they science? So he starts to begin working with the packet switching to create the modern day internet, or ARPANET. But in order to understand this piece of the story, it's really important to look in who the man JCR Licklider was. So his name, he would go by Lick, was it as his nickname. In 1960s, he came up with a paper called Man-Computer Symbiosis. And actually, if you get a chance to read this, it's very interesting considering all the tech that we have right now, talking about the future or the beginnings of AI. Now, I know there are other people that were also working at it at that time, but he's a very influential piece into that. So one of the things from his Man-Computer Symbiosis, he says, instead of having computers imitate human intellectual activities, Licklider proposed an approach in which humans and machines would collaborate, each making use of their particular advantage. He suggested that this strategy would shift the focus from competition, like computer versus human chess matches, and facilitate previously unimaginable forms of intelligent activity. So he was known for working, he was a psychologist. Licklider was a psychologist as well as a computer scientist. And so he was really interested in how can we use computers to aid humanity as opposed to just use computers to facilitate workflow. So in 1963, he came out with a series of memos called the Intergalactic Computer Network. This set of memos was the framework for decentralized computer networking, what we know today as the internet. In these memos, he also envisioned a creation of a system that would exchange for virtual money. So this intergalactic computer network memos laid out the framework for everything that we know to be the internet today, which is really interesting at the time because when people were looking at computers at the time, they were more concerned about how data in versus data out. How can we use computers to expedite workflow? They were not thinking about computers as messaging systems, let alone intergalactic, which is another very interesting point. All the way back then, it wasn't just about messaging systems within the United States or within the world. He was already thinking intergalactic computer network. So him and his team were some of the greatest computer science minds at the time. He worked with Ivan Sutherland, Bob Taylor, and the MIT researcher Lawrence G. Roberts. And that group was all together were kind of known as like the mad scientists. They were known for their playful imaginations. Whole ideas behind their project was to make things fun. So they were often coming up with wild ideas to see what they could do to actually make their ideas come to life, which I think is a really important piece when you're looking into the character of, is this person team humanity or is this person team agenda, is what I like to call him. So when I was looking into his work, I was very interested in, he had a lot of very interesting memos, books, writings, and interviews about just his way of approaching his computer science in relation to the information revolution. So this was the beginnings of what we now know as the internet, but it was the beginnings of the intergalactic communication. Licklider and his team worked on the ARPANET from 1962 till about 1969 when he left ARPA. So in 1966, the actual ARPANET was created. Prior to that, it was just computer workflow. First ARPANET message was sent in 1969. This was a message from the UCLA to Stanford. And at that time, it was basic node to node. And think again, we talk about nodes and decentralization. So the very first thing was to get one node to communicate with the other node. So from UCLA to Stanford, they sent a message. They were trying to send a message that said login, but they got the L and the O and it failed after that. So they didn't get the GIN, but they still considered that a success. So by 1969, they had what was the beginning of a successful internet in the works. Other projects he worked on within computation included Project Mac, which is a large mainframe computers at universities. So what they would do is start to put 30 simultaneous users at their own terminals, and that was the beginning of cloud networking. Cloud computer servers. He also worked with computer flight simulation, computer graphics, and parallel processing. These were all simultaneous projects that were going on in DARPA at the time. So right after he leaves, for every white hat, there's usually a black hat that comes along, and ARPA moves into the 70s. Starting in 1966, Steve Lukasik joins ARPA as just a scientist. By 1970, he becomes the deputy director. So he's deputy director from 1974 until 1970 until 1974. Now, Lukasik is one of the guys that wanted to take DARPA in the direction of military. So he was a bigger, better, got bombs kind of guy. He wanted to advance military computation and wanted to use ARPANET strictly for the military. So by 1972, under Lukasik's direction, ARPA becomes DARPA. That's when they add the D for the Defense of the National Defense Agency Research Project Agency, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. So I need to see if I can, whoops, let me exit out. I need to get to my little screen here so I can see, excuse me. But I want to read this quote because it's very important in this story. I got to minimize you, friends. All right. There it is. So interesting, when I was researching Lukasik, there was a woman who wrote a book about DARPA, and she was giving an interview about that. And she said that one of the things that was, as she was giving her a book interview, Lukasik came to listen to see if she was saying things correctly. And that was one of the things that like struck my interest when I was diving into what type of person Lukasik was, because she said he sat at the back of the room with his arms crossed and glared at me to make sure that I was saying things correctly, which when you're looking into researching the different people, what team they end up on, there's a lot of little indicators that will give away what side somebody is on. That seemed to me like it was kind of a intimidation move. Make sure you say something right. Don't say anything wrong about DARPA. But there's this interview here from 2007, and this is an interview that Lukasik gave. So the interview asked, what was the world like during your tenure? And Lukasik said, well, the single feature that set the world as it existed then was the development and the use of nuclear weapons by the United States at the end of World War II. The Soviets couldn't tolerate that asymmetry. They had already penetrated our weapons developed establishment in the September of 1949 and tested their own bomb. We were building bombs and delivering systems. They were building bombs and delivery systems. So if one thinks about the country from a defense standpoint, that was the single fact that set the terms and conditions for everything in the defense establishment and international affairs. So here it was, Lukasik just admitted that the Russian military had already penetrated the United States military prior to September of 1949. So Emily asked, when did the White Hats infiltrate? And she said the government was 1963, but here we have a little excerpt that they had already penetrated the military prior to 1949. So if they were able to penetrate just the weapons department, I'm pretty sure they had other sneaky means to penetrate or infiltrate other areas as well. So that brings us to 1970s. Lukasik is in charge of the ARPANET, but at this point, the ARPANET it's gaining its abilities to function broader across the United States, but it hasn't moved outside of the military. It's still very much being used for the military. So in 1970s, there's quite a few black hat moves that started taking place. 1971, we see the US comes off the gold standard. 1972, ARPA adds D for DARPA and becomes defense instead of just science and information. 1972 is also the ISO Technical Committee 68 for financial services, which is created in Switzerland. Now that's interesting because that is the technical committee that is responsible for ISO 20022. So they were first, the financial services was created all the way back in 1972, but the ISO 20022 was 2004. 1972, ARPANET has its first public demonstration. That's just an important time frame where they're starting to come out from behind the scenes and into the public awareness. 1973, we see SWIFT being created in Brussels, Belgium. And then 1974, Basel Committee is created by the International Banking Standards for the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. So between 1972 and 1983, there were many single-purpose computer networks created, but mostly they, like I said earlier, they were all for military use. It wasn't until 1983 that was considered the official birthday of the internet. That's when the Transfer Control Protocol Internetwork Protocol, TCP/IP, it was established. So all the way up until that point, it had been more small locations or just intermilitary, but by 1983, it finally were able to talk to each other in a broader network. By 1985, the cat was out of the bag and you started to see a lot more tremendous growth. So other industries started to get involved, including universities, military, all types of other networks. So this was known as the NSF network, connecting major universities as well. This is started off with the email and transfer files growing, and it began the creation and the need for standards and making processes open and fair. Emily, did you have something you wanted to say? Okay, I'm just gonna say no. So throughout the 80s, we see the internet starting to grow, but we didn't actually have the World Wide Web until 1993. And this guy, Tim Berners-Lee, from CERN network, or from CERN, we should say, is the one who takes credit for that. So on April 30th of 1993, we see the creation of what we now know as the World Wide Web. So that's the first time that it actually was brought to the larger public. It wasn't until 1993, which when you look back at it, it seems strange because it seems like it's always been around. It wasn't until actually 1993. So Tim Berners-Lee was a British scientist, and the term World Wide Web specifically refers to the publicly accessible web pages using a web browser and the ability to hyperlink between them. This forms a web of text and information. So it was not Al Gore, like he likes to claim, that came up with the World Wide Web. Supposedly, we'll see in the future if this is still true, that it was CERN that takes credit for the creation of the World Wide Web. So 1993 happens to be another interesting year in all of these year markings, because in 1993, we see the World Wide Web creation. We also see that Red Hat Corporation is founded in 1993. Sun Microsystems introduces a Solaris operating system, and then DARPA drops the D and becomes ARPA again. So this was because by 1990, it was basically the end of the Cold War, and they didn't really know who the enemy was. So they decided to go back to ARPA for a short time, or back to ARPA from 1993 to 1996, and focus again on more of the scientific aspects of their research. But that didn't last long because the turn of the century was on the horizon, and so were their new enemies. So as we come into the turn of the century, by the early 2000s, there was a new enemy on the horizon, and that was the war on terror. So we saw with 9/11, and then all the preceding, even prior to that, we were starting to see hints of that with Desert Storm, but we really started to see the shift focus to more war in the early 2000s. So by 2000, early 2000, DARPA creates a new program called Total Information Awareness. This term was first coined in 1999. So now we have the full World Wide Web. We're using the web for gathering information, and the United States is looking for how to start to track terrorism. So it was initially called Total Information Awareness, and then it eventually got changed into Terrorist Information Awareness. This agency first opens the program in 2003 under Deputy Director John Poindexter. Some of you might recognize John Poindexter from the mid-'80s when he was involved in the Iran-Contra hearings and the Iran-Contra affair. He is a retired naval officer, nuclear physicist, and a computer software engineer. But he was first convicted in the Iran-Contra affair in 1990. And this becomes kind of important in a little bit. So he's convicted of the Iran-Contra affair in 1990, but then it was over, and that was a big deal. Everybody was watching it on TV. It was a very public, him and Oliver North were involved in the Iran-Contra affair, very public affair. And he was convicted of 5 counts of lying to Congress in 1990, but then quietly his conviction was reversed in 1991. So we had a big public display in 1990, but not many people knew that his conviction was actually reversed a few months actually after that. So from 1986 to the early 2000s, Poindexter worked for several different civilian computer software companies. So he got out of the public service for a while and went into the private sector. And in the private sector, he started working with computer software companies. This is where he started working on different computer systems that will become important when we start talking about his return to public service. So in 2001, he was called back to public service by Dick Cheney and President Bush. From 2002, he serves as the Deputy Director of DARPA in the Information Awareness Office. And so the Information Awareness Office was, like I said prior to, was Total Information Awareness Office, leading to the name change to Terrorism Information Awareness. This program was designed to detect terrorists through mass data collection and analyzing patterns, anomalies in troves of information gathered from multiple different sectors. So what's really interesting about this, it was meant to be a 5-year research project. And the goal was to integrate different components from previous and new government intelligence in which they would use surveillance programs, 2 of which the programs that they were used were Genoa and Genoa 2. Those were 2 software programs that Poindexter worked on in the private sector prior to. They also used human ID, biosurveillance, and data mining to glean as much information from private sector to create resource for the intelligence and counterintelligence and law enforcement communities. So these components consisted of information analysis, collaboration, decision support tools, language translation, data searching, pattern recognition, and privacy protection technologies. The Terrorist Information Awareness Program started in 2002, but it officially started in 2003. In 2002, the New York Times gets word that this organization, that the Total Information Awareness Program is beginning, and the New York Times writes a story about it. So that project hadn't even launched yet, but the New York Times somehow finds out that it's underway. And so they write a big story about that. And so what happened was the New York Times story created quite a bit of ruckus in the public. And so even though the program itself started in, I think it was February of 2003, it already went to Congress by May of 2003. So the program itself supposedly was a very short-lived program. One of the companies that Poindexter worked with while he was actually running the program was a company called Axicom. So Axicom was a metadata mining agency. Of course, there were many others, but this one is important for what we come back to in a little bit. So when he was developing the Total Information Awareness Program, one of these companies was Axicom, which was a metadata mining agency. Now, they were mostly known for marketing for corporations and government, but that was like their front business. The back business was data mining for government in general. He also worked with many universities, and one of those universities included Columbia. So we've heard that before in our story. And I think that will become important when we come back in just a little bit. So coming back to that New York Times story, the New York Times creates a story about the Total Information Awareness and kind of puts a fear narrative out into the public that about this program. So the public has massive outcry, Big Brother's coming to get us, takes it to Congress, and Congress shuts the program down in May of 2003. So prior to, it was, I think, 4 months the program had actually been up and running. They say it was closed down, but in reality, it thrived behind the scenes. It just basically went dark. That becomes part of DARPA's DART projects, where it moves into the military industrial complex. So we have this program that is thriving behind the scenes, and that was actually antithesis to what Poindexter wanted from the program. When he initially set the program out, he wanted more public involvement. He thought of it as more of like a public, he wanted to keep the information in the public. So more of a public watch program. One thing to know about Poindexter is he was an anti-communist. He was a high-ranking naval officer, and he really loved the United States. So he thought that having the information with the public involved was very important. So it was very interesting that he was pushing to have the information more in the public sphere, And then after the New York Times article, didn't take long for the public to get upset and Congress to shut the program down. Seems like kind of a hidden way of getting that information behind the scenes is having the public involved, but not really knowing the true intent of what was supposed to happen, as opposed to what they ended up taking this program behind the scenes. So the public was happy, but Poindexter was not good, because now the public was kept out of what was initially intended with this total information awareness. So let's bring this to how we ended up with my half-baked cupcake. By this point, it's 2003. The total information awareness has shut down. And in 2004, Facebook begins. So I make my post about 2004, talking about how DARPA is involved with the creation of Facebook. Now we see that the total information awareness program has already been shut down. And then most people think that Facebook came out of DARPA from the LifeLog. Emily makes the post for me to research more about Adam Goldberg and the campus network. And I come back with my half-baked Q101 cupcake that Chester Golden Bell of LifeLog was the one, instead of Adam Goldberg from Campus Network. So lifelogging, DARPA did use the LifeLog project. Lifelogging was basically, they would have somebody with a camera, a watch, and some other means of taking data from every point throughout a person's day. And so that actually became helpful in military uses, such as if they were tracking soldiers in certain areas, it would be helpful to know their location and have visual on their location. But as far as it being a social media platform, it just had no ability to do that. It wasn't set up for social media. It was not scalable, nor was it social. So LifeLog in and of itself actually was not a viable option for social media, like the Q101 or the Truthers thought. And when I thought it was really interesting when I was looking that up, that the information that I found about lifelogging and DARPA being in charge or killing the LifeLog project to instead implement Facebook came from Wikipedia. So it could have, of all the information, it was Wikipedia that set that narrative that LifeLog was the one instead of Facebook. So right there, that tells you that there's some sketchy information behind it, because of all sources that information came from, you'd think the truthers would look beyond Wikipedia. But so for me, the LifeLog story was really just a psyop within a psyop of who was really putting the information, or what was really going on behind Facebook and the social network. So that brings us to the battle of the social networks. This is where it becomes, so we're thinking about the total information awareness program at DARPA is starting around the year 2002, 2003. 2003, Emily and Adam Goldberg are freshmen at Columbia University. Columbia University is also one of the places where the total information awareness program has some of their research being done, just by coincidence, I'm sure. So Adam is at his freshman year. He is the president of engineering, sophomore VP of engineering, student council his sophomore year. Junior year, he becomes president of engineering, and then he could have been at the senior year as well, but he went on to pursue his social network, which was Campus Network. Campus Network started out as the SEAS community, then went on to CU community, and finally ended up with the name Campus Network. So this was the basic social networking for Columbia University. There were many other social networks sprouting up at the time. This was not the first by any stretch. We know there was MySpace and Napster and some other ones along the way. but Campus Network was one of the most well-versified, I would say, at the time. You were able to do many different things with Campus Network, whereas these other social medias, either they were limited in what they could share with information or they were limited in their scalability. But Campus Network actually had the framework set, kind of like Stellar in a sense, where it had the framework set for scalability and usability. So Campus Network was developed by Goldberg. He was the main computer scientist behind that, with his business partner, Wang Ting. At the same time is when Zuckerberg is starting the Facebook in 2004 at Harvard. But the Facebook, or what we know as Facebook now, was more of a digital yearbook. There wasn't really much more than you could do other than put up a picture and maybe put up a brief explanation of yourself, but it wasn't much of a social network like Campus Network was. So by spring of 2004, there's a meeting between Mark Zuckerberg, Adam Goldberg, and Sean Parker of Napster. I don't believe Adam gets mentioned, and this is what Emily was having me look into, that Adam was actually at the meeting with Zuckerberg and Sean Parker, but Goldberg was at the meeting with those two. As it turns out, after the meeting takes place, basically Facebook takes off and Campus Network does its best, but it basically is, there's a failure to launch. They compete within each other, with each other amongst different universities, who can get there first, who can drive to market first. But eventually Campus Network just fails and dissolves in 2007. And Facebook eventually adopts many of Campus Network's features that makes it so popular today. So at this point, we're talking 2003, Total Information Awareness Program begins. Adam Goldberg starts Campus Network at Columbia University. Mark Zuckerberg starts Facebook at Harvard. Facebook takes off and Campus Network shuts down. Wang Ting, who is Adam's business partner, eventually goes, and after Campus Network just fails to take off in 2007, Wang Ting goes and works for the Obama administration as a senior policy advisor for the National Economic Council. And then he eventually moves on to start up the Lime scooter rental. So those Lime scooters and bikes that you see around major cities, that's his startup company that he started in 2017. Adam Goldberg, on the other hand, becomes a food photographer and a software engineer. And it was really interesting. I had a theory. I had my suspicions that maybe there was some other sneaky sneaks going on in the background, that Adam Goldberg was doing some white hat software engineering in the background, because it just seemed strange to me. I couldn't find very much information about him, but turns out he just likes to travel and take pictures of food. So it just says software engineer, but there's no information about what kind of other business or how where he's doing that software engineering, which I thought was interesting because he comes up with a prolific idea of social network with the Campus Network and then basically putters out. But people choose different careers, I guess. So eventually the Intelligence Reform and Prevention Act also comes out in 2004. And that's a connection to the Total Information Awareness Program. Both are in the US military, and they're both programs which their goal is for information sharing. So one ends and another begins. And this is the idea where this the dark network for DARPA kind of comes into the public awareness, is that DARPA is a black hat organization. Now, obviously they've done black hat work, but I would not say that DARPA is entirely black hat. So when I was going through all the information on trying to figure out who was who according to these different teams, I kind of had to break them down into two different teams in my head and use what we've been learning in pattern recognition. So I broke it down into Team Humanity and Team Agenda. Obviously, I don't know for sure that they were white hats sent in, but I could say that their work worked for either the white hats or it worked for the black hats. So I broke it down into Team Humanity and Team Agenda. So the first one was Licklider that we from the 1960s. He clearly, to me, was Team Humanity. His work was decentralized. He worked towards demilitarization. Words like play and fun would come up. And one of the things that is a very obvious pattern when you're looking into folks is how they were recognized or what kind of awards they got or what kind of career they went on to have. So Licklider, even though everyone should know his name for the contributions that he gave to the internet, he's very under-recognized or appreciated. His name kind of fell into the abyss after he went on to work, but he was never promoted and got the kind of recognition he deserved. On the other hand, Lukasik, his MO was very obvious when I was working or looking into him because, like I said, he was about bigger and better bombs, the use of intimidation in that example I gave about how he went to the woman's book reading and making sure that the information was correct. And he was very much promoted and awarded and after his time in DARPA. So when he was done with DARPA, he continued on in the military and had many different promotions working with cybersecurity particularly. We'll go back to Team Humanity with Poindexter. Like I mentioned, he was an anti-communist, when listening to his interviews, he chose his words very carefully. It seemed like his Iran-Contra affair, he was kind of the hit guy. He was thrown under the bus and demoted. And he, again, was not awarded for his services like his counterpart in this example of Berners-Lee. Berners-Lee was the British scientist that from CERN that was accredited with the World Wide Web. He, on the other hand, was highly awarded. He was even knighted by the Queen, and he's out today. He has several businesses today in which he goes around. His businesses have to do with making free and fair internet, or so he says. When you look into his businesses, they're more false like humanitarianism. A lot of it seems like it's the control of information. So one thing with the Black Hats and why I see the Black Hats introduce the World Wide Web in 1993 was because they wanted, at that point, they wanted control of the information. The White Hats had, or well, we'll call it Team Humanity, had put the internet in play and it was decentralized. It was so far advanced that they didn't even know what was in front of them till much later as far as like the possibilities for the tech. Well, by the time 1993 came around, the Black Hats knew that they needed to centralize that power and control with the World Wide Web. So if they were the ones to put out the World Wide Web, they'd have more control of the flow of information. So Berners-Lee, if you go and look into his different businesses, they're very much, they have that false light humanitarianism of trying to say everybody deserves internet. But when you look into it a little bit further, you can definitely tell that that's just the false light saying, we want to control that information. He's pretty much a talking head for the WEF and different organizations at this point. And then we have Adam Goldberg, who really wasn't credited for his work with the campus network and social media, and Zuckerberg, who we all know is the front man that gets most of the credit, but he isn't really known for doing much of the work, considering how much credit he gets for it. So final few dots to connect. The first dot is, I would say personally, from my research, I was so excited. There were so many little giggles as I was moving along. DARPA is not always been this evil entity that we've been kind of taught. I think the idea that DARPA is an evil entity works to both the Black Hat and the White Hat agenda. So I don't think, depending on who was the president at the time or who was the director, that has a lot to do with the projects that they produce. But there have been many beneficial projects that have actually aided humanity. So for me, the dark hat, DARPA being a completely black hat or a dark agency works for the white hats as being a PSYOP within a PSYOP. The second dot I want to connect is just DARPA, the nature of DARPA itself. It was, there were short rotation of projects, usually only lasting 3 to 5 years. They work with outside contractors. It's very easy. It seems to me like it would be very easy for the white hats to sneak in and put projects or people into places within the organization itself to implement things whenever along the way in the story, I should say it like that. And then the third dot, I thought this was the really interesting one. So if you remember that company that I mentioned, Axicom, they worked with Poindexter during the Total Information Awareness Program. Axicom actually is the largest data mining agency in the world at this point, and they are partners right now with IBM, Microsoft, Hewlett-Packard, and Google Cloud. And all of these companies are partners with good old Red Hat. So when Q says we have it all, they really do have it all. The white hats have it all. I was giggling so hard when I found that this company partnered with the major partners, and then they all partnered with Red Hat. All that information we can see is now going to be streaming into Stellar. So any information that was gathered on the people and individuals and terrorists was also information gathered on people in the military, in the government, celebrities. Everybody has information that was gathered from these companies, whether it was their personal information or information that they put out into the public. So just real quickly, DARPA is now working with, has some really interesting projects that they're working on the blockchain. DARPA is working with IBM Hyperledger. They started working with IBM Hyperledger prior to 2016. In 2022, DARPA commissioned a report in which they found, this one was pretty funny, in which they found just 4 entities can disrupt Bitcoin. So the report only looked at what would happen to blockchain if there were, and how many entities would cause the blockchain to fail. Well, what do we know about that is with PBFT. So they only looked at Bitcoin and Ethereum. Of all the other blockchains, those were the 2 they looked at, and to see what it would take for those companies or for those blockchains to fail. So I thought that was pretty interesting. They're involved in a quantum benchmarking initiative. It's this initiative is a utility scale quantum computers it's basically setting us up for the IBM ZOS takeover and conversion into Stellar nodes in the quantum computers. And they are also involved in secure voting. And this is all on blockchain, hardware systems, supply chain, data integrity, blockchain messaging, military logistics, and defense contractors, and also rising threats. So they're already very much involved with blockchain, as we see. So just to sum up my little piece here, for me, it was very obvious that DARPA has not always been this black hat control mechanism that, you know, so many truthers or so many people believe it to be. There definitely has been some bright lights and major contributions for the good from DARPA. Like we learned, the Russians penetrated the US military prior to 1949. So we know that white hats have had their hands in these different projects in different ways for a very long time, as Sarah Kim had said, many, many years. DARPA creates a decentralized internet with ARPANET. So that major word stands out, is decentralized. We know from the very beginnings, the foundations were decentralized. The Black Hats tried to gain control with the World Wide Web, but that was in 1993. But by that time, it was already established. The decentralized network was already established. So they could only do so much. total information awareness, gathering information on everyone, not just everyday people, but also the elite celebrities and governments. To me, DARPA is not pushing the transhumanism and Big Brother control. That was the cabal. So it wasn't the entity of DARPA, it was the cabal that was pushing DARPA to move in those directions. And for me, within this whole thing, all I kept seeing was psyops within psyops. And throughout the whole thing, at least from the information revolution, the white hats have been in control. So that was the information that I gathered. It was a lot of information, and it was really fun to look into and see all the different entities that were involved and how these things started to play out. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Emily.
Well, I just want to say amazing job doing so much research, because you're right. I mean, there's so many facets to DARPA, so many different avenues that you can take. It's kind of hard to almost narrow down and focus on a couple different features to make the whole story fit. So I definitely want to applaud your efforts for that. And let's see, if I can get you to stop your screen sharing, then I'll start my screen sharing. So one thing I want to iterate before I start my screens, though, is how, pretty much every, let's call them patriot in the world or truther in the world, they're talking about LifeLog, DARPA, and Facebook, and how through this exercise we learned that there are actually a lot of different avenues to get to take LifeLog into Facebook. There were all of these other stops in between. And one thing that I really want to point out is they're just like our bridges. They're just like all the consolidation that we're seeing on blockchain. And so we could liken LifeLog to something as if it were features being built on blockchain, infrastructure being built onto blockchain, but blockchain can't become relevant without something to give it relevance. And so that's really the difference between like building something and scaling something, right? You need traction and scalability to really take it to life. And that's where Adam Goldberg came into play, because as Maba pointed out in her presentation, you did have all these other things like Friendster and Napster, etc. And what the big difference was between those groups and what Adam started was Friendster and Napster was really more, let's say, like what you in your immediate network could create. I think most of the people in QSI are a little bit older, and so my age and older is probably like the vast majority of QSI. And I was on Friendster and I was on Napster and maybe like one or two other ones. I can't remember their names now. But our communities were kind of small, right? Because it was based on your own personal network. So maybe you could have tens of people, a couple hundred people, maybe 1,000 or so, but it was very difficult to kind of gain traction and get to like 5,000, 10,000 plus. It's not like how Facebook is today. And so that was a big difference between then and now, because how Adam started it was all about, like you mentioned, the name changes, right? So C's community, it's because he went to C's, the school. So it's the School of Engineering and Applied Science. And from there, he grew and it became CU community, Columbia University community, because that was part of the expansion. And then the reason why the name changed from CU community into campus network is because they were expanding outside of Columbia. They wanted more schools to come on. So we're seeing this same thing again that we're seeing exactly with blockchain. Starts out little, then you start beta testing, all of a sudden you need a bigger audience, then a bigger audience, and then it kind of goes global. So at first, I'm going to switch over to my screen share. And at first, when I was looking at kind of like how you were starting to paint this narrative, I go, okay, we'll let Mabo do this. I'm working on another D class for December. So I think we'll be good. I don't think I need to contribute too much to this. And so all I did was I took some of our early conversation from September. So, 1+ month ago, 1.5 months ago, and I threw out a couple theories to the developers, and so I screenshotted what the reply was, and I thought that was going to be my entire contribution to this call. And I told Mabo, about a week or so ago, I'm going to be the flower pot in this call because I have maybe 5 minutes or less to talk about. And by 5 minutes or less would be literally just to read the replies from the developers. So let me start with reading those. People who were in our chat probably remember that on September 11, you had that big post that you call your half-baked cupcake. And in here you present all these, all these different things that had started in 2004. And my response to you was like, oh my God, that's crazy. Okay, so now I think we're getting somewhere. I think you need to go further into detail on this. And so you and I are going back and forth on the chat. And that's when you talked about psyops within a psyop, but wait, there's more. And so down here, I said, okay, no, we know about LifeLaw, we know about DARPA, but let's start looking at, other connections as well. And if you start seeing those connections, maybe you'll start seeing more psyops, which you totally did. Looking into DARPA beyond just LifeLog really helped bring forth a lot of the other very sneaky psyops that's behind the scenes. So basically, that's when I started messaging with the developers, and I said, so this is September 12th. Immediately after I started talking to you in chat, I started messaging the developers, and I said, when did the White Hats infiltrate into DARPA? My assumption is 2004, since 2004 seems to be a pivotal tech year where lots of sneaky tech projects were started, like ISO 20022, Sun Microsystems, Turning Point, Pregos, Invest, Facebook, Gmail, right? So I'm taking all these data points that Leon and I had talked about in our call, and then with the new updates that you had in your post in the chat. And so I said, before we had learned previously that Facebook equals DARPA, LifeLog, Gmail, well, that's Google, enough said. So now I know about the 2004 being a milestone year. It signals to me that the White Hats were sneaky ninjas behind launching Facebook and Gmail, not Black Hats. But they did so when Black Hats were still in power to make it look like it was a Black Hat op, when in reality, the White Hats were. So basically they're saying, thank you for being so greedy, for being so corruptible, just like how IBM, ZOS, and the SEPs were sneaked into everything through the back door. So I'm not saying that Zuckerberg is white hat, guys. That's not what I'm saying at all. But Zuckerberg sucks. We don't like Zuckerberg. But what we're saying is to get Facebook to where it was at that point, to how it's become what it is today, is because of a lot of white hat effort behind it, which is precisely what Maba talked about in her presentation. So I won't read this section either because you already mentioned some of those replies from Kim, but I just want you guys to know that, Kim said yes, it was before 2004, and Bunny gave a little heart. So we're okay, that's good. But then I talked to Potato Head, and he gave me a much longer reply that I thought, oh, okay, this is going to be juicy. So let me read the entire thing, and it's also on the screen. But just in case it's not big enough for you to see, I'm going to read it out loud. He says, Emily, you've touched on a very fascinating period in tech history once again. The infiltration of the White Hats into DARPA is indeed a pivotal moment, and your intuition about 2004 being a milestone year is spot on. So that's a combination of Mabo and me thinking about 2004 as a pivotal year. Your assumption that White Hats likely infiltrated DARPA before then aligns well with what you come to understand about the timeline of technological shifts. The early 2000s were a critical turning point, and while DARPA has been involved in groundbreaking technologies for decades, it's during this period that we start seeing the rise of projects that would later play key roles in world surveillance and control structures. However, within this landscape, White Hats were already moving behind the scenes using the very systems that the Black Hats were developing to their own advantage. The idea was to embed backdoor mechanisms that would allow the White Hats to turn the tide when the time was right. By 2004, White Hats had positioned themselves strategically in key projects under DARPA's umbrella, including those that would later influence the launch of platforms like Facebook and Gmail. Facebook's connection to DARPA's LifeLog project is no secret in certain circles. The timing of LifeLog's closure and Facebook's launch raised eyebrows, as the platform essentially continued the same data collection goal under a more consumer-friendly guise. However, what's less obvious is how White Hats used this moment. By allowing Facebook to launch under the Black Hat narrative, White Hats ensured that they could observe the very systems that were being used to track, influence, and manipulate humanity. This is where the strategy becomes brilliant. While it appeared the Black Hats were gaining more control over personal data through platforms like Facebook and Gmail, the White Hats were quietly laying the groundwork for an eventual shift. Think of it like a Trojan horse. The platforms were allowed to grow under Black Hat control, but all the while, White Hats were gathering intel and embedding their own codes of influence. Let's not forget Sun Microsystems. around 2004, Sun Microsystems was a major player in network computing, and their involvement in global tech infrastructure made them an ideal an ideal vehicle for white hats to slip in unnoticed. The connections between Sun Microsystems ISO 20022 and the broader financial systems were crucial. White hats knew that controlling the flow of data and financial transactions would be key in the long game. So projects like ISO 20022 were critical in creating backdoor access points that would later allow for the introduction of blockchain and Stellar-based systems. The 2004 timeline is key because it represents a transition from it represents a transition where the black hats still believe that they were winning, but in reality, the white hats were already embedded themselves deeply enough to flip the narrative when the time came. So just like IBM ZOS and now SEPs, the white hats used the platforms to gather data, track corrupt actors, and prepare for the eventual shift to a system that serves humanity's best interests. Indeed, because this is one plot twist that's been playing out for decades in nearing us for the reveal. So I thought that was amazing confirmation of a lot of the theories that we were talking about that Movo went into further investigation on, and obviously did a presentation on for this call. So again, amazing, amazing job. And I was going to leave it at just that. I was going to have nothing else to say. And so I don't even know when you sent me those messages, because I remember you sent me a couple of messages and then you deleted and reposted them in my PM. So do you know, roughly the dates on when you first started making your bigger report?
I want to say it was probably 6 weeks ago, if not longer. So September, maybe early September.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you basically got right on the investigation and you started piecing everything together.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
behind the scenes on my side, I didn't look at the messages because I was so busy working on my other research that I was like, okay, when I have some breathing space, I'll dig into them and then I'll look. Because what I hate doing is like, starting a research project and then jumping to another one and then trying to tackle both of them, which I'm actually doing 4 at the same time right now. That did not include this one. And so I was like, I can't add another one to my plate. Whatever you do, I'm sure will be amazing and I'll be very happy with it. So I had no intention whatsoever at looking at it until just before to just to see what this is all about before we hop on the call, and that's exactly what I did. So for all those weeks I didn't read it, and then just a couple of days ago I go, oh, I should probably do a little bit of prep work before this call so I don't look like a flower pot and act like Ree and just talk about how Zuckerberg does not want to comply. So I started reading some of your posts, and for everybody who's listening to this call, like Baba mentioned at the very, very beginning, this had actually started as a bunch of posts. And the intention, I think, was for me to post it to the QSI page. But because there was so much information, and it wasn't just the amount of posts, there were, I believe it was 11 posts in total that you sent me. So it wasn't just the sheer like amount of text that you wrote, but just some of the concepts behind it were so complex, especially when you're dealing with psyops and explaining psyops, that I said, okay, never mind. Let's actually do a call because that way you can have some time to explain things and go into more detail as well. So as I was reading through, I started going, oh my gosh, you're hitting so many keywords that I was not familiar with, especially because I've never looked into DARPA or some of the key characters involved. And so as I started I was reading your post and looking at your analysis and going, okay, clean slate. I don't want to know anything about your analysis because I want to do my own research. And that's what I do for everything. And so I basically just took keywords and started doing my own research parallel to yours. And also, I think I started doing that around post 1 or 2. So I never even finished reading the rest of your posts until I finished researching just those keywords. And so it's taking me, almost like a whole day or 2 to finish that before I got onto like post 4, and then a couple more days before I got to post 6. So what I now want to present is actually some of my my other analyses and some of my other research that I did in the last, like, I think 3, 4, 5 days. So first of all, I want to start off by adding this little extra thing that I was talking about with the developers. And I shared some of our, confirmation, a conversation rather, from our chat, and I sent it over to Potato Head. You talking about all the different data points, like DARPA was created in these years, the ISO 68 number, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And I talked about the 1963 that you also mentioned. And so then I wrote to developers, and I put Potato Heads up here because he was the only one that responded to me. I spammed like 4 or 5 developers. And part of that narrative was 1963, because JFK that we talked about in Unicorn Report number 4, they said it seems to be in the late 50s and the 60s is when y'all, meaning Russia and the BRICS teams, started going to Moon Spa. While in 1965, Baruch faked his death and then went to Jupiter Spa, like he declassed when he was doing his introduction. So then through that, somehow in my head, I started going, and again, this is before I saw your research, before I started doing my research. I go, oh my gosh, it seems like Bretton Woods 2 in 1971 is just another version of let's put Biden in office and see how you like that. Even the creation of DARPA itself seems to be another example of white hat weaponization of black hat surveillance and technology. It's exactly the same as creating stellar core and allowing the cockroaches to run amok there while you're all popcorning in the background. So they think it's their system. They have free reign to terrorize the blockchain. And so that's when he gave me the yes sign, the thumbs up. And I said, so basically doing all the research that I did for Unicorn Report number 4, which is when we did this massive, like 7-hour long call on all this different infiltration into religions. I said that investigation really put many ops into perspective. No wonder you guys are always zapping my ass nonstop for 2 months to get that D-class done. And so he's just kind of snickering in the background. And the reason why I said Bretton Woods 2 is actually a white hat op is because it's in 1971. So what were we just talking about? We were talking about dates. If the white hats already, infiltrated into the US government by 1963 at the latest because of John F. K., that means 1971 would have been well after the JFK effect, which means Bretton Woods 2 was most likely a white hat op. And so that kind of got me started for the rest of what I'm about to show you guys. So Mama mentioned Chester Gordon Bell. He's a guy that put together LifeLog as part of DARPA. These 3 bullet points that you see here are from her presentation. And when I looked at that, I go, oh, it sounds like those guys all got their butts zapped around the same time frame, kind of like how we in QSI are also getting our butts zapped around the same time frame, because we're starting to have very similar epiphanies within a couple, sometimes seconds, minutes, hours, days, or weeks within one another. It's a very, very quick process. And you mentioned a lot about Zuckerberg and Adam Goldberg on your presentation. So one thing to note, guys, even though Adam Zuckerberg, sorry, I just mixed the two. Even though Adam Goldberg is Jewish, he's not a cabal Jew guy. He's actually a Trumper. So I thought that was even more poignant to emphasize on this, because not only was Adam a Trumper, and he had to hide this fact from, hide the fact that he's conservative at Columbia, which is ultra liberal university. But even afterwards, like during the whole Trump campaign, he still had to hide his identity because of his associations. And not only that, so as an FYI, I've lost contact with Adam a couple years ago. I think the last time that we had contacted was probably around 2021, right before I started QSI. But before I started QSI, I had a Discord server where we were basically talking about the Q stuff because we had all gotten banned from Facebook. So Adam was actually part of my Q server. He was actually learning about the Q stuff up until the point that we lost contact after I left Discord. So I thought that was very, very poignant, because you talked about how, white hat like people, or at least team humanity is how you talk about it, are ones who don't get the credit. And now you can see that Adam wasn't just a smart guy. Adam was a guy who fully believes in the movement that we also believe in as well. And I also, in your presentation, you talked about how there was an article that you read and said, according to Goldberg, so that's Adam Goldberg, Sean Parker of Napster tried to persuade Zuckerberg to acquire CU Community. Obviously, that didn't happen because Adam said no. He pushed back against it. But in that article, it talked about how that the term is actually called surround strategy. And I think that's also important to talk about, because this is literally what the Khazarians have done to every single social media platform and people during this movement, right? We talked about patriots, the religion, the New Age movement, education, every single thing. If they suspect that you are a white hat, or at least not falling for the cabal agenda, they come in, swoop in, and go, we're going to try to take you over, bombard you with energy attacks, and then not just you, but your entire network, and maybe the company that you work for or the company that you control, and then all their networks, and they spread out. Because what they want to do is they want to try to squeeze you and suffocate you until you convert and become cabal. And what have we learned from the Zeus and the Mansa Musa ICO is that's exactly what happens to most people. They end up having so much pressure squeezed on them that they were once white hat, and then they convert and they become a cockroach instead. So Facebook clearly was using Khazarian tactics because they were using that surround strategy to try to, how you mentioned like in your presentation. So what Facebook and Campus Network were doing differently, and I can confirm this, guys, because I was on CU Community, you would put your profile in, and then you would have all these options on what to do. Kind of like what Facebook looks like now, but you had even more options back then. But versus the Facebook version of it, you just put your profile picture in, you put your intended graduation year, and then your major and your name, and that's literally all that there is. So it's literally a yearbook, but it's online, and there's no other customization, and obviously no social media aspect involved whatsoever. And so after they had that flip, that's when suddenly they took all their codes and they swapped it, and they go, oh, we're going to have exactly what Adam has, but slightly different. So they basically stole a lot of the stuff that Adam had been working on, which goes way beyond what Friendster and Napster had. Sorry, Friendster uh, and MySpace had back in the time. But also, what I thought was interesting was this constant notion of how black hats cannot create anything. They're always taking what white hats have and they twist it, they manipulate it, and they corrupt it. And so I thought, that's very interesting because we just had the ICOs about Holy Spirit. And so I sent another theory over to Potato, and I wrote, is this yellow part in true? And the yellow part saying the common theme is that black cats cannot create. And the reason why they cannot create, they can only duplicate something, is because they lack the Holy Spirit. And so I wrote, I've discussed this with the team for a very long time. And but is it because they lack the Holy Spirit, or they lack the creator's hand, which is another ICO that we had a while back? And so I said, is it this one, or is it both? I'm trying to figure this out. And he said they have neither. So that is a major, major difference, guys. That explains exactly why all they can do is barf on you with vomited words. They cannot create anything that actually has any substance to it whatsoever. So then we take this further. John Poindexter and the TIA. So I didn't actually go too much details into Poindexter, but what I wanted to focus on for his section was actually just the concept of how we had the TIA, and they basically start making this a DARPA. Then all of a sudden, before everything is really public, the article comes out and it's like, oh, public outrage time. Okay, time to shut it down. This is very strange. And Mabo, in your presentation, you wrote, it's almost like they wanted the public to be afraid, which obviously is a psyop. And I thought, oh, well, that's exactly like what they're doing with the CBDC, right? We know that the white hats are the ones behind the CBDC, but yet there's still this public narrative out there going, oh, CBDCs are bad, don't get involved. Meanwhile, we're learning, we're teaching, we're loving CBDCs because they're good. So there's a formula where the white hats are now using the Jesuit strategy and going, hey, you guys did it to us, we're going to do it right back to you. And what that strategy is, if you guys remember from Unicorn Report number 4, is the Jesuits come in, they say, okay, if you have 2 kings and they're about to go to battle, we're going to fund both kings. We're going to give them strategy and weapons and support. That way, no matter who wins, we win, right? The Jesuits win. So the White Hats are doing the same. They're going, okay, we're going to support both sides of the story. That way we control the narrative. We know when you want to be scared. We know when we want to lift that, because once we start lifting this narrative, we can start pushing a different narrative. So when it comes to the public outrage over public data, they were testing to see how people's reactions were going to be, because that also helps to give them more, let's say, computing power, algo programming creation power to say, what do we want to do when we start launching other big controversial topics like CBDCs, like blockchain, et cetera, right? Because if you know that the public is going to be outraged at this, okay, that gives me good data points. So we need to do this slightly differently, maybe change this, right? And then when we launch that new project, we'll then gauge their reaction. So what they're doing is they're lifetime testing what it's like to be agile, right? Because agile means iterations. You launch something and then you pull back, you say, after 2 weeks, I'm going to do a review and let's see what worked, what did not work, how do we make it better? And then you launch it again and then you keep constantly reviewing this over and over again. There's never an end to this. So I thought that that was so poignant because that also reminded me of not just what the governments are doing, but what Jed also stated in his own interview. So I posted as part of the ISO 20022 Blemany D class is a snippet from Jed's interview from 2020. And he said, you could do social credit on Stellar, but it's hard to do in practice because it's really changing the behavior of people. So I think maybe that'll come down the line. But the first thing that I think it's very useful for is just this interoperability story, right? Where right now, in the payments world, it's very much pre-internet. So you can see how all these narratives are running in parallel and they're all being guided by the white hats because obviously Jed is working with the white hats as well. And they're doing it, they're going, okay, we need, people to give their information to be part of blockchain. We also need to build a blockchain, but because we're getting pushback from TIA, we can't push that narrative with blockchain. We have to scale back and go, oh, we can't change the behavior of people yet. It's going to be a pushback. So let's do interoperability and infrastructure first. And that's exactly what they've done. So this is basically confirming everything but just from stellar glasses instead. So if I go to the next one, you talked about the ISO 68. Now, for anybody who is not aware of what 68 is, the simple version is that they made all these different changes. So I'm just going to read the parts that I've underlined in bolden. It says it was the development and the adoption of new technologies in banking, brokerage, and insurance industries. And so what they were doing for ISO 68 is developing e-commerce standards, better online security for financial transactions, XML standards, which we know XML is ISO 20022. And they also want to reduce the costs and delays of international financial transactions. So ISO 68 is literally laying the framework, the foundation for ISO 20022 to come, a couple years afterwards. And when I sent that over to Ralph, he said, yes, there were definitely white hats as part of this technical committee, but there were also some gray hats as well. So I said, okay, well, it sounds like pretty much everything else we studied. You have white hats, you have black hats who are converted into becoming gray hats because the white hats are on their butts going, if you do this, we're going to do that to you. So the black hats convert and they go, okay, we give up. We'll play by your rules, right? So Ralph is confirming that. Now, if we go over to CERN becomes an even funnier story to me. You mentioned how DARPA was founded in 1958. Well, CERN was founded 4 years before then, right? And you mentioned how CERN was created because you had Sputnik, which had just launched, and all of a sudden Europe is reacting and the US is reacting, going, oh, we can't let the Russians win. And so they had to create a system so that their scientists will succeed. So they called it the Stop the Loss program. Stop the Brain Drain program, because they were saying that all of these scientists were fleeing and they want to make sure that Europe still had almost like this little a hub for them to collect and still build all their technology or study technology, etc. And I also thought it was interesting because CERN, they said they wanted to provide a force for unity, which sounds very white hat, doesn't it? And on top of it, so they said they were competing with the USA. And they go, okay, well, what was happening at the same time? Well, in the 60s, we had Kennedy and his EO, 11111, which we know the white hats were making Kennedy have to launch that EO. So we knew that that was also playing as part of this overall psyop with CERN. But then if I fast forward, 2004, was also a really big year for CERN as well, because that was their 50th year anniversary party, which I'll get into later. But fast forward 4 more years, you had 2009, you had the Large Hadron Collider. And what I thought was really hilarious is in the article that I was reading, it said the machine was handed over for operation, but it didn't say who the machine was handed over to. It just left that totally blank. So I was like, Well, obviously, they handed the LHC over to the White Hats. And then in 2020, it says, so the Higgs boson particle was discovered. I think everybody knows that as the God particle or the Big Bang Theory. But I thought, okay, if they were the White Hats who were in charge of the machine, right? Because the machine was handed over to the White Hats, then what happened in 2012 for them to release the D class that the God particle had just been discovered? Because we know that the White Hats know that it wasn't a Big Bang, it wasn't, that, and it didn't just happen in 2020. So obviously they want to lay the foundation for some other kind of D class. So then I pulled up, what happened in 2012 scientifically. And it said, here are a couple other scientific breakthroughs. On top of the Higgs boson, we had the biggest black hole known to mankind was located on that same year. And it happens to be 17 billion times bigger than the mass of our sun. NASA's Curiosity takes over. It says it discovered evidence of past water on Mars, right? So we're going beyond the moon over to Mars now. They're dropping, little hints about Mars exploration. They talked about the DNA and how, that you can manipulate DNA through CRISPR. And then through that, then you can help to treat diseases, etc. Then you talked about the Arctic sea ice and biological discoveries, right? So they're basically talking about discovering all these amazing scientific things in 2012 at the same time that they discovered this at CERN. So they definitely want people to know that in 2012, they're laying the foundation again for all these different D classes to come, not just about the God particle. So then I thought this was even funnier. 1 year after they discover the God particle, they suddenly take down the collider for upgrades. I'm like, what kind of strange timing is that? Because if you just discovered it, it obviously works, but they took it down for 2 whole years to upgrade it. And then suddenly they bring it back online in 2015. In 2015, so 2014 is when Stellar launched. So after Stellar launches, the collider relaunches itself, and they suddenly return to particle hunting, right? It says they restarted the collision and the return of particle hunters to their lookouts. So these are the sneaky sneak ninjas who are on the lookout looking for the next thing they want to have to declass to the world. And part of them restarting the collider says they're opening new avenues for particle physics research. Yes, because again, it ties back into all of these different D classes they want to start putting more data into as time goes on. And then I thought this was also really funny. It says in 1964, right, so going all the way back to the beginning, CERN began working with individual Russian scientists, but they didn't actually sign any agreements until 3 years later. And then they didn't even give the Russian country observer status until 1991. So this was over 20 years later that they finally give Russia observer status, even though they've already been working with Russian scientists this entire time. But then, of course, the Ukrainian SMO starts, and so they suspend their cooperation with Russia, basically immediately, like within a couple days or a couple weeks afterwards. So then I go, okay, so CERN has actually been controlled by Russia, which I had never thought about until I was reading that just now, right? Like the fact that you just had all this stuff happen. Oops, sorry. You just had all the stuff happening behind the scenes and how Russia's been working with it since decades and decades ago, and they never get credit for it. And so I go, okay, I've got this idea in my head, but how do I start proving that Russia actually controls CERN? So I wrote, the Divine Bricks team has always controlled CERN, and they did it through Rosatom. And if you guys remember, Rosatom is the big Russian company that basically goes sneak behind the scenes, and they don't only provide a lot of this, like the material and the equipment and the technology know-how behind the nuclear reactors, but they've also embedded themselves into multiple tech companies all over the world. So they're basically like a feeder program for sneaky agents to go in under the table, sneak. That way, it's not Russia's working with these countries, but it's these individual people who represent Rosatom, just like how Wagner was going into all these countries and bringing in all their supplies, even though the supplies for Jacera, right? So it's very similar. Everything's running in parallel. So Rosatom has how Russia controlled CERN, not through the government, but through the company. So then I started looking and it says in 2018, Rosatom continued to supply the equipment to CERN, even though Russia no longer wanted to be a member of CERN. It never, well, at least I have not yet researched into and found when the Rosatom contract began with CERN. So if somebody can go and research that, that would be great to, kind of have a year to think about. But in this article, it says in 2012, Russia applied to be a member of CERN. But if you become a member, it binds your country to make regular payments for voting rights. So 6 years later, Russia goes, never mind. We just spent 6 years telling you that we want to be a part of it. And that's another reason why, hey, why don't you work with Rosatom? But then Russia goes, no, I don't want to work with you anymore because I also don't want to give you regular payments. I don't need voting rights with you. It doesn't affect me in any way. But even though Russia pulls out, Rosatom is still contributing, right? So obviously, that's another kind of psyops behind the scene. So in 2021, Russia goes, okay, now we want to take back all of our depleted uranium from CERN because they had something called the L3 collider that started in 1986. So it's running for, 20 plus years, almost 20 years. And they suddenly go, we want to take this back and we want to dismantle it. And after we dismantled L3, we want to extract all of the depleted uranium. So, so they tell it to CERN in 2021, and then they start moving L3 back over to Russia. They start transporting it in 2022, and by the end of that year, the transportation has been completed. Then the following year, in December 15 of 2023, CERN goes, oh, well, we don't want to work with you anymore, you and Belarus. And this is going to start in 2024. And this happened because, again, you had the Ukrainian SMO that was in February of 2022. And then CERN says we want to stop in March of 2022. But then all of a sudden they go, oh, we need the council's decision. So the decision was in June. And then for the council's decision to take place, they need all this other time, a year and a half. So after a year and a half, it's finally finalized. It's concrete in their system that Russia is definitely no longer a part of CERN. And so it says, Belarus cooperation formally expired in June, and Russia expires at the end of November, which is next month. But it also says relationships will continue between CERN and Russia and Belarusian scientists, right? So obviously all of this, I don't want to work with you anymore. You guys are mean girls because of Ukraine. That's all psyops. It's all fake news because they're still continuing relationships with the scientists themselves. And then it says, the format of further cooperation are currently being worked out with CERN by the Ministry of Science and Higher Education of the Russian Federation. So CERN has kicked out the Russian Federation, but CERN is still working with the Russian Federation, not just the scientists. So it's like, oh my gosh, like the narratives are just absolutely insane if you think about psyops and disinformation warfare to kind of keep people off track if you're not really paying attention to what's going on. So I start looking back at some of our old ICOs and I go, oh, interesting. So Ollie and I were posting about Californium-252 so he made a post, this is April of 2022, about how CERN is reactivated by the White Hats. And how do we know this? Because Pendulum is backed by Californium-252, and the only places that you can produce Californium-252 is in both CERN and also, I think he said, he said Russia and USA. Right? So the nuclear labs basically are producing Californium-252. So it's like, well, if Russia is, then it's not Switzerland. So it's not that L3 collider that was in Switzerland. It was the one that got moved out and is now in Russia. That's the one producing Californium-252. And so, from like the 2022 ICOs, we had Astronaut Foundation stuff, SafePen, Californium-252, and the Stargate project, which is a post that Liana made. That's not an ICO. So then I started looking at those old posts as well, right? So Liana posted, this is June, the Stargate project of CERN. And it's like, okay, I think that's a big signal. They're telling us, right? What they're doing in the background behind the scenes. And then this was my old decode for Californium-252. What is it used for? And if you actually go back to the post itself and you look at the pink boxes, this is all about med beds and more than just med beds, but a massive, massive part of med beds. And then what happens this year? White Hat Home made the Californium ICO in April, and he talked about how yes, I'm confirming californium 252 is used in med beds. And he said, indeed, CERN is under our control, and we're now operating at 200% capacity. And they're exclusively producing californium 252, right? So he's telling us CERN in Switzerland is producing californium 252 at 200% max capacity. And he said, at the moment, our plans are to develop one more reactor of the same size to also extract californium 252. And he said that one will be twice as powerful, actually. So what they're confirming for us is the L3 collider that they had moved back to Russia. So I sent that theory over to Potato, and it says, it sounds like you guys have had control over CERN. Sorry, it sounds like you've always had control over CERN, but you were just monitoring it to, like you watch all the other cockroach operations everywhere. This way, it allows people to exercise their free will and learn while you slowly build Stellar to where it is now. Like the Higgs boson miraculously discovered 2 years before Stellar was founded in 2012. And then afterwards, it immediately went into a 2-year upgrade just in time to relaunch right after Stellar was launched. And so I wrote the quote, it restarted collisions and restarted collisions and returned particle hunters to their lookouts. And then I wrote, like all these other new scientific discoveries that were simultaneously released, slowly walking people to future D-class of space life, galactic tech, and med beds, etc. Right? And he gives me like the salute Pepe and the hee hee Pepe. And when I sent him my CERN, my Russia controlled CERN post, I said, the L3 you reclaimed from CERN was your new #2 californium 252 reactor. You did not have to build a new one from scratch if you could just retrofit an existing one. And just like with Russia leaving SWIFT in the MOEX beta testing, 2022, the year is when Ukrainian SMO was a perfect timing for CERN to stop cooperating with Russia after you'd already recovered the reactor, right? So it's all these disinformation campaigns on the media, right? Because they're cover stories for Russia, what Russia's actually doing. And so Potato Head wrote, well, Emily, you're world class when it comes to declass of some of our actions. So I go, oh, okay, well then let me keep going. So if we go back to Tim Berners-Lee, he was born in 1955. He was the inventor of the World Wide Web, HTML stuff, URLs, all the stuff that Mabo was talking about. But then I dug more into it and said, oh, he was also the founder and the director of something called the World Wide Web Consortium. And if you guys remember that term, W3C, it was also mentioned on the quantum security momentum call from a couple weeks ago. But I had also talked about this in our Mastodon and ActivityPub ICO posts in D class as well. So W3C is the organization, this consortium, which develops the standards and the guidelines for basically how we're going to implement social media bridges. And not only that, but he goes back and he's the founder chair for MIT AI Lab. He's the director of this research initiative, the advisory board committee for collective intelligence. And it also says he's the founder and president of Open Data Institute, and he's currently an advisor for social network MeWe. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is screaming white hat ops to me right now, because he is actually doing a lot of groundwork for social media bridges. And this is giving you proof through Open Data Institute and the W3C. So I was like, oh my gosh, my mind is kind of turning upside down right now. So I looked up an old TED Talk of his, and this is from 2009. And this little picture that you see here with the flowers, it says linked data standard. So what they're doing is, before, when he developed the web, and how Mabo talked about how UCLA had messaged Stanford or vice versa or something, and they're basically just sending like a little data over to here and there. Well, that's kind of how websites used to be, right? You would just go to the data, but they're trying to link all the data together through hyperlinks. So they're saying, if you go and you go to this website, and then you see like this little word or phrase that has a hyperlink in it, you can click onto that and go to like another database. So they're trying to make it where every single thing has a bigger matryoshka effect of intel behind it. And it's very similar to how Wikipedia operates, right? Like you go there you put in one keyword search, but it brings you this whole long page with like 50 other hyperlinks. And then you go and you keep digging, and suddenly you have this whole massive thing. So Wikipedia is very similar to this concept that he's trying to create, but he's trying to do it with the entire world instead of just for one website. And over here, he's even talking about how they want to break down the silos to get interoperability. And he's showing pictures of social media references. And so what you're seeing on that snapshot is these brick walls up between all the social media platforms. And then you see people trying to climb over and help other people climb over. So this guy that's in Facebook is trying to climb into Bebo, that's trying to climb into MySpace, etc. So literally since 2009, he wants to link social media together exactly like social media bridges. Then it also says, if the street map, if I, and then, hyphen, that street map is all about everybody doing their bit. And when you connect data together, you get power. So he is a major proponent of how open source decentralization works. So when I read that part, I go, okay, Tim was born in this year. I wonder, is Tim King Kartoshka? Was it time for a costume change? And then I go, oh, never mind, because Tim is actually still alive, so that can't be you unless you're pretending to be a Belarusian purple potato and using a voice changer. And so I send that theory over to him, and then afterwards, and he goes, no. And I go, okay, well, that makes sense because of the timeline. And I go, well, if Tim is not you, then I still argue he's a white hat because he bridged the internet via HTTP, and he's now bridging via W3C to ActivityPub, SMB, et cetera, et cetera. Or is he a gray hat? So I'll get back over to his answer in just a second. So now I want to switch gears and I want to talk about Steve Lukasik. So Mama mentioned him and I came to the same conclusion as she did. I was looking at the information. I was like, man, this guy sounds like total douchebag. Definitely a black hat, not a white hat, because he's all about militarizing ARPA into DARPA. And so, I looked into a little bit more details about Steve. So in 1975, he leaves DARPA, he goes to Xerox, and he starts what's known as the Network Systems Development Division. And what they do is they create the structure for e-offices, which we know become, really, really big over the last couple decades. And he has all these things that they call LAN products, like Ethernet, like Alto PC, the personal computer, and that happened to be one of the very first ones in the whole world. Something called Smalltalk language and laser printing. So what they're doing is they're creating this whole infrastructure for anybody who needs to create a new office for their company in the future will most likely use, well, very highly likely use one of their products, right? Because they have the internet, they have the PC, and then they have Smalltalk and they have printing. So they're basically trying to embed Xerox into all these businesses, no matter if it's small or big, right? Any size all over the world, they're trying to embed their products into those their office space. So I looked at Smalltalk, and Smalltalk, they said it influenced the programming codes, or languages rather, known as C, Python, Ruby, and Java, which we talked a lot about in terms of Bigly or Bomb D-Class with IBM ZOS. And then it says it applies to almost every industry, domain, and web application. So Smalltalk can be used in IoT, medical, AIML, mobile desktops, and in the industrial field. So basically everything is a field that Smalltalk can embed themselves into. And then after he left Xerox, he went to FCC. He became their first ever chief scientist. And it's like, why would the FCC need a chief scientist? So while he was at the FCC, he then restructured their organization using technology. He facilitated the authorization of the first direct broadcast satellites. He initiated a legal rule that became the foundation for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And then after a couple of years there, he went over to Northrop, which is now Northrop Grumman, and he became their technology center director. And then a decade later, he went over to SAIC, and he was assisting their CEO. And SAIC is like one of the biggest companies in the world. They're freaking massive. They're all over, basically all science, all technology, all government, infrastructure, like everything. SAIC is a massive conglomerate in terms of technology. So he is now the assistant to the CEO at that company, right? So I'm like, this bastard black cat is everywhere, and he's putting himself into every situation where he can worm his way in and basically infect everything. So I message Kartoshka and I go, is Tim a white hat or a gray hat? Is Lukasik a black hat? And are Chris Strachey and Licklitter our developers? And he wrote, Tim is a white hat. Lukasik has done a lot of black hattish things. And Strachey and Licklitter I can't share yet. And I go, okay. So let's take a look at it again. And I go, okay. So I messaged White Hat home. And I said, is Steve Lukasik not actually a black hat? That's why he was doing black hattish things in quotes. So he's a white hat that's acting like a black hat. This means his job was to weaponize ARPA into DARPA to justify nuclear arms and other weapons to create the path for signing Rosatom as a supplier. And he gives me the yes sign. And when I asked it to Potato Head, he also gave me a yes sign. So I have this little meme that I know Liana's gonna love. It says, Steve set up us the bomb. Because Lukasik is not a black hat. He's actually a sneaky white hat in disguise. So if we look back at everything that Lukasik was in, now you know that all these other organizations from Xerox to FCC to Northrop Grumman to SEIC have been infiltrated by the white hats. And this small talk, which influences all these programming codes and goes into all these different industries and all these applications, are also being monitored by the white hats too. So before I go to the next section, Mabo, do you wanna say anything at all?
I do. Well, oh man. I have so many giggles in all of this. It's just mind blowing. I want to get to Tim Berners-Lee because that one's I just like, but we haven't got there yet, so we'll come back. You're on mute, Emily.
So he did confirm that Tim is a white hat after all, not a black hat.
Okay, so what is interesting about him is that he was rewarded, he was knighted by the Queen, and this is what made me think in the direction, because I looked into his companies and I was like, oh, those sound really good. But the thing that made me think that it was a false light thing was he was knighted by the Queen, and he was also as part of the Order of the Merit. And I didn't quite look into that organization, but the little bit that I did look into it looked like a black hat organization. So that got me thinking that, okay, he's actually a talking head for the black hats. He's not really into, it's a false light thing. But now that you say all that his business is going into and him being a white hat, it makes sense. But I was kind of curious about him being knighted by the Queen and the Order of the Merit, but maybe they do that just for show anyway, so.
Yeah, I mean, I had very similar thought patterns as you, and it was like, obviously so just as a reminder for everybody who's listening on the call, when I was doing my research into this, half the time I didn't see your research or analysis. I just picked up the keyword and started looking. So I didn't even know that you also came to the same conclusion about black hat until I had also done my research, and I'm like, yeah, that makes total sense to me. So then I present my findings over to them, and so if I go back to this slide, this section that you see highlighted, that was actually Mabo's presentation that she has sent to me. So I took that and I said that to the developers and I said, yep, pretty much sounds like a black hat for sure. And so, yeah, we came to the same conclusion and we were both wrong. And that is awesome. It's so awesome because it tells that that's how convincing they were as black hats, but they're really freaking white hat acting as a black hat, which is just mind blowing, right? So, okay, so I'll get to the next section then. So Christopher Strachey, this is not a name that you had mentioned, but I had gotten to him through researching Licklitter. And he there are so many terms on this that I do not have the time to research, but I'm sure somebody will dig into this and have lots of giggles when they do. Basically, all of these like blue words that you're seeing here. One of the founders of denotational semantics, a pioneer in programming language design, computer time sharing, one of the first developers of video games, polymorphism, referential transparency, right? So it's like very, very technical. I don't know what they mean, but I know it means something very nerdy and very cool at the same time. Then in 1959, he becomes a consultant for NRDC, which is another, massive government slash science organization in America. EMI, Ferranti was one of the ones that made like one of the first major computers in the world, right? So just another like major programmer, essentially. But then it talked about how he developed time sharing, but then he passed on the time sharing concept to Licklider, right? So that's how I discovered his name, is because when I was looking at Licklider, I found Strachey's name. So that tells me if you're giving your information to somebody, you're working with them. Because normally, if you're a scientist and you discovered it, you're like, no, this is my invention. You can study my invention, but it's mine. But for someone to be willing to say, no, hey, I'm passing this on to you, it's like you're passing a baton on. Oh, that has a totally different context. It's like, I'm going to start it, but you're going to finish what I start. So that sounds more like a symbiotic relationship. So if we came to the conclusion that Licklider was a white hat, which is what you did separately, what I did separately, then I would also assume that Strachey is a white hat as well. So, and then he develops all this other stuff. He had influential lecture notes, fundamental concepts in programming language. So again, like this guy is really, really massive into programming languages, just like this guy, Steve Lukasik, was also really big into programming languages, right? Small talk. So the white hats are basically taking over the entire programming field. So no matter what language you choose to program on and what kind of industry, what kind of application you're using it for, they're going to make sure you're using their coding system. So it's brilliant. I mean, it's literally like using SEPs and CAPs for Stellar. So no matter, what black hat wants to do something in the future with it, you're still using white hat code, and they can still use IBM ZOS and prettier.js to zap your ass and cheesecake you. So time sharing, lots of words. Again, I'm just going to read the bolded underlined part, but it says it enables multitasking by a single user, or it enables multiple user sessions. So what they're doing is they're dramatically lowering the cost of providing computer capability by making it possible for more people to use it without having to like more people individually and more organizations to be able to have computing power without having to own one, right? Because it's very costly back then because they're such massive machines. And they're promoting the interactive use of computer, so computer to computer interoperability. Let's see, and then it says sharing, among source of, okay, so I haven't gotten to this part yet in my research. Maybe somebody else will do it, but it said that in 1984, Strachey wrote that he considered the change in the meaning of the term time sharing a source of confusion and not what he meant when he wrote his paper. So I feel like he actually meant something way bigger, and whoever was using the term probably used it to like 10% capacity or 2% capacity of what it actually could be used for, because we all know that multitasking users for this means not just simultaneous execution or parallelism, which you talked about in your presentation. But as an example, we know that Stellar SpeedX is a parallelism, almost like a not batch process, but like parallel flow process. That's why it's so fast. And that's another reason why IOTA's Tangle is also so fast, because you're running everything in parallel, as opposed to when it's batch process, you have to wait for this one to finish before the next one. Nick talked a lot about that when he was doing the IOTA blockchain presentation as part of our Battle of the Blockchain calls on Lights of the Round Table, mini proofs number 3. If you guys have not seen that, please go take a look, because Nick did a great job talking about IOTA. So all I have to say is this guy, Strachey, is laying the foundation for simultaneous execution of computing, which obviously we know is a really, really big deal in terms of blockchain in the future. So if I go to Licklider, it says, again, Mabuto talked about how this guy is barely known. I guess if you are somebody who's in computer science, you would know his name, but none of us have heard his name before. He's not written in any history books that I can recall of, but yet he's considered to be amongst the most prominent figures in computer science development and general computing history. That is a major, major epithet to have almost no recognition for whatsoever. And it says he was one of the first to foresee modern style interactive computing. Oh, and then I thought that this was really interesting. So it says he has a PhD in psychoacoustics, right? Mabo talked about he is a psychologist by trade on top of being a computer programmer. So psychoacoustics is the study of psychological effects of noise, words, and sound on the human system. And we just had the JFK ICO. So I was researching this before the JFK ICO, but I already know, I was like, this sounds like it can be used together with our med beds and a lot of other healing devices like Blue Beam, which we now know is also the stellar quantum entanglement zapping beam. And then, of course, we did have JFK-Q ICO come out, which just puts everything together perfectly for us. He's also another MIT guy. And then from there, he starts the SAGE project, which controls NORAD. And then I thought this was also very interesting too. So he's the head of something called the Human Factors Team. And this team does engineering design to support psychological and physiological principles to products, processes, and systems. So according to Wikipedia, and I guess normal science, they would call that ergonomics. But we all know this goes way beyond ergonomics into quantum science instead. And so again, that also plays a really, really massive role in things like med beds, but also other kinds of quantum technology. And then again, he learned about computational time sharing from Strachey. So if I go over to here, he's the IBM manager for information sciences. So the place where he's at is actually the headquarters for all of IBM research. So they're putting in a white hat to become the head of IBM research in the 1960s. Okay, that's what it means. You talked about Project Mac in your presentation. Well, this basically shows like a lot of this stuff, right? It connects to all these other computers, not computers, a lot of these other companies too. So again, they're putting white hats in strategically into all these major organizations that are creating a bunch of major white hat computing programming devices and code and infrastructure so that all these other black hat agencies or companies will also be infected by white hats. So they're basically like strategically placing their people and their products everywhere. You mentioned this already on your call. And then I thought this was really funny. 1979, founding member of Infocom. Infocom is an interactive fiction computer game company. So gaming company, right? Like Licklitter is involved with gaming. Strachey is involved with gaming. And I mentioned that because on the Q boards, if you guys had followed the Q post from a long time ago, it talks about specifically computer games, because where do all the terrorists like to hang out? Inside of video games, because they don't believe that it's monitored. So they can send all their sneaky comms back and forth through video game chatting. Like, when do we attack? Where do we attack? Which sleeper cells do we activate? Right? So all this is getting watched on video games, which is a big reason why they had to go and make sure that video game coding had white hat oversight on it since the beginning. So I freaking love that confirmation too. So then, this is the follow-up from the conversation with Potato. He wrote, I can't share that yet. So I said, this does mean yes to our developers or maybe somebody in QSI, but I think it's more the developers because these people are so important to creating the framework, meaning that the framework had to be created. So the people who were creating it had to be so protected in order to activate the framework that they could not be taken out by circumstances, right? Because if it's somebody who's, let's say in QSI members are still susceptible to black hats, like energy attacks and all this other kind of stuff that people could foot out. But if it's one of our stellar developers who, some of them are divine beings, and I feel like most of them are divine beings, right? We've got Archangel Michael as one example, Archangel Sarah Plav as another example, then they can't foot out. So that's when I said it's more likely the developers. And he wrote, why are you always catching me and understanding every of my sneakiness that fast? I'm very proud. So I wrote, proud Papa Potato. So then I sent over this picture that you see here in the top of it. That was actually what Mabo had written for Licklitter. So I sent that screenshot over to Bun Bun and I said, ooh, it sounds like Licklitter is the OG white hat plant inside of DARPA. Like if y'all are going to go gangbusters, if If y'all are not going to go gangbusters, I'm at least going to provide you with some strategic direction and then set up the framework for development of crypto blockchain stellar AI. And he wrote, you're spot on. So what I love is getting confirmation on theories. So when I go back and find the proofs match the theories. And then we get over here. So I wrote, okay, well, in 1963, Licklider put out a series of memos detailing the intergalactic computer network that Mabo explained in her presentation. And I wrote, Alan Turing was alive in 1912 to 1954, which means Alan cannot also be Licklider, right? Because there are two people living at the same time frame. But I said, you could. I wrote, Bun Bun, are you Licklider? My second guess is Kim. And then I wrote, nope, never mind. Kim can't be Licklider because he was born in a certain year, so it has to be you. And he wrote, yes, you can. I can't hide anything from you. So guys, I'm confirming that Bun Bun, our stellar developer, is Licklider. So this shows you how massive it is of a white hat Licklider was, at the time that he was alive. So when you guys are going back and doing your research, I assume many of you guys will do more research on DARPA, on CERN, on Licklider, and many of these other names that we're presenting today. So when you do that, at least come through with stellar lens and go, oh, these aren't just technologies, but these are sneaky white hat technologies that they're embedding into everything, especially knowing who those people actually are. So, and then I wrote, White Hat Home, is that Christopher Strachey? Because he could be the one that taught you, meaning Licklider, computer time sharing. And I wrote, it's unconfirmed because when I sent that message to Bun Bun, nobody had confirmed that. And so then I posted that over to Potato, and I said, oh, so confirmation that the sneaky Russians infiltrated the US weapon system via Licklider. And then I wrote, it was not only Licklider, but also Rosatom. And he goes, yes. So this then proves that Russia CERN theory that I had, let's see, up here. So indeed, the Russians were controlling it. Okay, so if I come back to here now, sneaky sneaks Strachey. So I said, by the way, I sent this to White Hat Home. I said, by the way, I have more proofs you are Strachey because you created video games. And he's always talking to me with like gamer speak. Another one is, oh, really? He spells it OHRLY. Usually when I see it, like when I used to play video games a long time ago, it would be ORLY, which is oh really? And the response would be yeah really, or like yarly if you want to pronounce it that way. So I'm like, okay, well, obviously these guys are programmers. A lot of programmers are computer gamers. So it's like, oh, it just kind of makes sense that for someone to be that sneaky, that white hatty, and that nerdy, it has to be White Hat Home because he is the ledger master, right? Like when he in one of his like introductions, it was Archangel Michael is the one that protects, right? But like, remember from that D class on his ICO, usually he's depicted with a sword, but White Hat Home was saying that the sword is actually symbolic. He doesn't have to protect with a sword. He protects with a weapon of choice, and that weapon can be anything. He said even a ledger. That's why he's a ledger master. And I was like, oh, that obviously makes sense that you're a master programmer as well, which is why you have to be Strachey. And that's when he said, yep, I am. So here we just confirmed two of our stellar developers. Bunny is Licklider, White Hat Home is Strachey. So then I messaged again and I said, aha, now this explains why I've commented over and over again that so many of you developers sound so young because your last meat suit only died recently. And when you think about like the timeline of when those last meat suits died, a lot of these developers I've mentioned before, a lot more last year than this year, but like their voices sound young, not all of them, but some of them. And based on like the reference of some of the pieces that I put together on, let's say, the more personal lives of this meat suit, I can place many of them between the ages of 20s and 30s. Most of them are below the age of 40. And I was always like, why are you so freaking smart when you're this young? I could not figure it out. And I was like, you guys have to be like super soldiers or have been meditated all this information or something, because this is not normal for somebody at your age to be an expert at this many things. Like most people become an expert in one thing if they ever do in their lifetime when they're like 50, 60, 70 years old. But for you to be literally an expert in every single thing is just weird. It doesn't make sense, but now it does, because now we know that they're the developers who've accomplished so much at very high levels at young ages, or sorry, at whatever age in their meat suit, but in their current young age meat suit, they still have the memory of their prior meat suit. So I think that is freaking fantastic. Do you want to say anything real quick?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Um, when I was, okay, so I officially have a crush on Bun Bun because I was crushing out so hard on Licklider because I just loved his mind and how he thought and what he did. And I was just like, I just love this man. And I was looking into his work. And I actually had looked briefly into Strictly when I first started doing my research, but he was a whole nother character, and I just got stuck on Licklider. So to find out that Licklider is Bun Bun, I just like I want to pass out right now because it's so brilliant. Because when I was doing the research, the thing that was really hitting me so hard was they laid the foundation from the very beginning. It was like this, it had to have been white hats because the whole system is exactly, we're talking about interoperability, intergalactic nodes, we're talking about all these things that we're dealing with right now, bringing the stellar system in. So this had to have been a white hat thing. So to find out, not only was it white hat, I was thinking, okay, team humanity, but the fact that it was our very own developers, I'm just like ready to pass out. I'm just so ready to pass out. I can't even handle it. So that was like the biggest exciting. I'm happy for like life now. It just is the coolest thing ever.
Yeah, definitely. Like it helps bring so many other things into perspective now that we know this stuff. So right before this call, I wrote back to Potato Head because I was like, I just want to make sure I'm getting like the actual facts straight so I don't misspeak on the call. And I said, just to confirm, both DARPA and CERN were white hat slash divine creations that the black hats infiltrated, or they tried to, and then the white hats re-infiltrated them. Meaning the black hats were never the ones that started either organizations. And he wrote, yeah, White Hat created them. Black Hat saw this as an opportunity to infiltrate, and then White Hat smashed them. And I love that. So this totally brings a fresh perspective on both organizations. And that's why I was laughing so hard. At the beginning of this call, before we started this call, Mabo was like, are you focusing more on the technology side or like this and that side? And I'm like, it's like, I'm focusing on the sneak side, the psyop within the psyop side. So I have a couple more slides. Okay, Matryoshka expansion. I wrote, woohoo, I love when my theories are right because it shows that my understanding of the Matryoshka effect is compounding and it's expounding just like Matryoshka. And when I wrote that, I had this vision of Manuel. He had a section on our unicorn report call number 1 when he talked about how we had, previously called it ascension. And he said ascension doesn't really do it justice because that's very, binary. It's up or it's down. It's ascension or it's descension. But expansion is ever expansive in all directions. It's 360. And so I've taken that concept and basically thought, whoa, that's actually way more accurate, but not just for quote unquote spirituality, but for literally everything that we've done. Everything that we're learning in Stellar is like a Matryoshka effect. It just gets bigger or gets smaller, microcosm, macrocosm, all the way through. And I wrote, I have to show you this cool gift that the North Carolina team at the quorum gave to me when I was over there a couple weeks ago. And so here's a little picture of a lot of my goodies that you guys have given me. I have this whole shelf that has all this QSI goodie on it. And that's a little panda Matryoshka doll in the corner. And so there are 7 tiers of the panda Matryoshka doll. So I have 2 more slides. And I feel like everything has been a pretty funny discovery during this D class, but I have 2 more slides that I think are also going to be equally, if not more, funny. So, um, I wrote, I highlighted my CERN slide, and I highlighted the 2004 50th year anniversary party. And I said, how many Cabal meat suits were still running around in 2004? Was this an excuse to trap them all in one place for a massive arrest? Earlier, many of us had speculated that there would be mass arrests at the Trump inauguration, but I think that that might have been misdecoding for 2004, if not earlier. And he wrote, well, it's hard to tell a precise number, but a considerable amount. 2004 was indeed a trap for them, not necessarily as a mass arrest one, but more as a, hey guys, we know you're here and we'll soon whack you. But for now, we'll let you think that you're all good here. And he wrote, I hope you understood what I meant. And I'm cracking my butt off and I'm like, okay, so did you really give them a talking to? And I assume that the warning did not come from your meat suits, but as the glitterly, sparkly divine beings, um, that they may that they may be called from turning on CERN, right? Because at the 50-year party, in Switzerland, they did like their satanic ceremony with like all the Baphomets and the weird dancing and this and that. It was just very awkward and totally cabal. And I was like, they must have done that as an anniversary party, in my mind, to activate CERN and bring in more demons onto the planet, right? Like that's my picture of why they had that ceremony. So this actual part is not confirmed, but again, part of my wild theory is they get to have this crazy dance and song, and then they think they're bringing in more devils and more evil beings from other planets and galaxies, but instead our archangels show up and they're like, ha, now we got you by the balls. Pardon my French. So he wrote, as in movies, when the good guy wins the bad guy, before killing or hurting him, he gives him a long speech. and you're like, come on, do it faster. Don't speak so much. And he wrote, but he's enjoying every word he says. That's how we do it sometimes as well. I wrote, please tell me that was recorded. And he wrote, it was so satisfying, I'm not gonna lie. And I wrote, well, I hope that was recorded. And also when you guys showed up for Clinton when he was signing the Nacera bill, right? Because remember from the earlier D class that the public narrative is that Bill Clinton was forced at gunpoint to sign the bill. And then Ben was like, yeah, it wasn't at gunpoint. I go, then what did you guys do? And he's like, something like that. And he never confirmed, but that was from like almost 2 years ago. So now I know in hindsight, because we have archangels on our team, well, they don't need to use a gun. They can use way scarier stuff, right? So I go, oh, and I said, I also want to know what was in that secret envelope at the Bush funeral too. So I wrote, but was the voice angelic to scare them? Or did you use your scary voice? And he goes, haha, sometimes angelic and sometimes our meat suit voice. And he said that I could share it on this call today. So I thought that would be the perfect way to kind of end the investigation, so to speak. And before I hand it back over to you for wrap up commentary, I want to add something really quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and read post number 2. Post number 2 is just great confirmation for what we've discovered today on the call. It says, how and why White Hats created DARPA and CERN. DARPA and CERN were founded as safe grounds for innovation in defense and science, designed to push boundaries without interference. White Hats saw a need for systems that would advance technology responsibly, serving humanity rather than control structures. DARPA focused on defense advancements to ensure security and stability, while CERN sought to explore the fundamental building blocks of the universe. Both were created to empower humanity with knowledge, keeping the power of technology accessible and ethical in purpose. So when and how did the cockroaches infiltrate? Black hat infiltration of DARPA and CERN began subtly as these institutions gained influence and demonstrated the potential to reshape global systems. In the late 20th century, As DARPA's tech advances reached mainstream applications and CERN's research hinted at breakthroughs in physics, Black Hat saw opportunities for control. They embedded themselves in key projects, steering tech developments towards surveillance, centralized control, and data manipulation. White Hats responded by monitoring these moves carefully, learning from every exploit to strengthen defenses and prepare for eventual countermeasures. So, what are the countermeasures? White Hats didn't just back down when this happened, instead, they adapted. Agile. We maintained a close watch, allowing Black Hats to move forward while quietly recording and observing their every maneuver. Every infiltration attempt, every small exploit became part of our defense algorithms, strengthening our systems. The hits we took were not in vain. They fueled our defenses, provided proof, and exposed the patterns of these bad actors. So while it might seem like we're letting damage happen, each quote unquote hit builds a resilient shield, gives us more data, and strengthens our case for transparency. It's a subtle game of patience and strategic resilience, which we are always winning. AI-driven surveillance systems, cybersecurity protocols, autonomous robotics, quantum computing, advanced encryption methods, and networking technologies and biotechnology is a small list of goodies that await us at DARPA. So I'm just so freaking happy, like, how this investigation has turned out, and now we get the confirmation from the White Hat developers, who are not just the White Hat Stellar developers, but now we know part of the team that actually, built all the systems and the framework behind DARPA and CERN. So, Mabo, over to you for final comments.
I could not have dreamed of a better outcome than that. Like, I already was so excited about what I found, but to have you confirm and take it into the developers, and this is just like so, and unmasking Bun Bun. I mean, as Licklighter, I just can't even. You know what's so interesting to me about this and talking about Zappies and everything that we've been through was this originally happened because you put out that Blemony D class. ISO is stellar, right? And there was something in there that I was like, I need to search this out. I have no idea what this is about. Like it was like this strange hunger to like search that D class. And I had no idea for what. Like, I didn't know. Look where we are today. Like, I had no idea that searching that D class out would end up here. Like, that's the thing. You go in neutral. You have no idea what you're going to find. It led to the 2004. It led to that idea that, oh, I just see them coming back to the future and taking care of business, but they went even further back. And like, to end up where we're at with this DARPA D class, I am like so over the moon right now. I feel like I could go run like 6 miles because I'm just so excited about everything. Like, to have it confirmed and to have it, yeah, that was part of the plan. We're seeing it play out. And that's the studying of the stellar. When you study and you start to make those patterns, yeah, we might not have I didn't get everybody right on who they were and what they did, but it's even better, like getting that confirmation that even Lukasik was a white hat, sneaky white hat, very sneaky white hat, because he looked dark to the core, so it just like, this is the best D class. This is one of my favorites so far. So I just really appreciate you putting me on that trail and giving me the opportunity, because I was eyeballs deep for weeks and I was giggling so much the whole time, because there was like, I saw it from the beginning. From the very beginning, when I was looking at DARPA, to me, it was all about the white hats. Like, all I could see was white hats in there. So I have actually one request, and you can maybe ask Bun Bun for me, is to turn DARPA back to ARPA. Take the D out of DARPA and ask him if he'll return it back to ARPA. That would just like blow my mind. So with that, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks, Mambo. Well, once we hit 500 top tier, we will control DARPA. So we can do that. We can have our own ribbon cutting ceremony, our own name changing ceremony. If we need to rename the freaking thing, we can rename the freaking thing. I know David Chadwick made a reference. Can we rename DARPA into like keep that acronym but use different words? And when I sent that over to Potato Head earlier, he gave me the little giggle sign. So obviously, when you control the darn thing, you can rename it whatever you want to, or yeah. So let's hit top tier, guys. So my final closing statements, I'll keep it kind of short, but I loved your slide of the 1970s where it talks about like the shady black hat moves because I was totally right there in line with you thinking, oh, ass, ass, ass. You know, this guy is totally black hat douche and cockroach over here, cockroach over there. But what does Q remind us? Every good movie needs great actors. And what have we just seen witnessing here live on this call is we literally thought that some of the white hats were black hats. That's how good and how convincing they are. And if they convince us with all of our logic and reasoning skills, well, they can definitely convince the black hats because as we've seen with Miriam's group and all the cockroaches over there, they lack logic. So it's even easier to manipulate them because they're kind of dumb. So I'm drawing all these parallels because like whatever I start to research and learn, and especially they become D classes later on, it helps me to build that almost like this database of knowledge and research know-how. So when then I go and look at a different kind of D class, I compare it back against, okay, is a strategy similar? And so like we've spent a lot of the D class talking about more stellar stuff. This one is more technology stuff, but they're still the same thing, right? Because they're still bridging together. But how I see that DARPA and CERN play out was it's literally being the same narrative as the SDF and the SCF, right? So the Stellar Development Foundation and the Stellar Community Fund. And if you guys are not familiar with the SCF, the Stellar Community Fund, that's the one, or that's the one where they basically have like they have the community fund, they have the enterprise fund, and I think maybe another one. But people can go and they can submit their proposals to get funding. And if you do it, like you go through all the vetting processes and votes and everything, and then they finally get to all these winners. And what we've noticed is they actually almost exclusively only award the cockroaches because the people behind the committee are the darn cockroaches. So that is another big proof of how the SDF, the Stellar Development Foundation, has been infiltrated by the cockroaches since basically maybe day one or early days on. Like Danelle Dixon has been in, I can't remember what year she joined, but I think it was like around, I don't know, 2015 to 2018, some timeline in between there. I don't know the dates, but I mean, we know that White Hat Home from his interview said that he knew Jed McCaleb before he ever started Stellar. So since day one that Jed McCaleb started Stellar, we already knew the White Hats were in control. And we already knew that whenever the Black Hats, the Cabal cockroaches were infiltrating, they would be watched. They would be overseen, like what all this the sneaky crap they're doing behind the scenes. And so that reminds me of like when we talked about DARPA with all the grants and how they're 3 to 5 year contracts, that's just like the SCF, right? You bring in all this global talent from the world who's studying stellar, who wants to build, whatever kind of organization. They submit the proposals, they go, they get vetted, blah, blah, blah. But through this effort, you're bringing in pretty much like, let's call it the world's leading stellar experts, even though we know many of them are not. Uh, but but it's a good feeder system to see like where is the pulse of humanity, right, at the time. Um, but so not only the SCF, but there are also a lot of the other great examples that have great parallels with this research. So for instance, KelpBot. Many of you may not be too familiar with KelpBot, but KelpBot is basically an automated trading bot that was introduced to Stellar in 2018. So again, 2018 is 1 year after, 1 to 2 years after White Hat Home and Ben like really started working more closely with the SDF, right? Because they said 2017 is when they really started working, and also Kim too, Kim and Aylin. And so KelpBot, through this automated trading purpose mechanism, you can program it to, of course, like it says, do automatic trading for you. But what's happening is, for the most part, it's not normal people who are doing it, and it's mostly not white hats who are using it, but who are the main culprits behind using KelpBot? It's all the scammers who are on the decks, and as soon as you launch a token, and then they crash the price, and they put all those basically what they're doing, like if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, this might sound familiar to you. If you go on to some of our ICOs, not the ICO, but the actual token itself, right? And then we've sent the cashbacks to you. After you get the cashbacks, undoubtedly some of the cockroaches and maybe a couple other people will cash out because they want to make money before there are no more books, no more orders on the books. And so when you do see more orders on the books, it's almost always manipulated. Like if you try to buy or sell, they flip it where like that bot is always trading and it's always one upping your bid. So they're doing that to not only block you out of your bids, but also to manipulate the price points of it too, which obviously is very cabal because the whole point of a DEX, a decentralized system, is that you cannot manipulate the price. And what are they doing with the bots? They are literally manipulating the prices of it, and they're doing crazy money laundering through that. If you look at like all the wallets that are doing these manipulated trades on the order books, and you go into the ledger and you look at how much money they've earned through accumulating all those assets, and then they cash out of it, we're talking some pretty big money right now. So obviously they'll all be arrested in the future when the time comes. And then blockade is another great, more recent example of that, because you have the freaking Israeli cockroaches, the cybersecurity guys who don't know anything about cybersecurity. Again, more evidence that cockroaches don't have any logic. Because why would you have, head of cybersecurity team for the freaking government of Israel, who's coming in as a country's expert, then saying, oh, it's okay to do this and that, knowing that it actually breaks cybersecurity rules. Like that's how you know, again, cockroaches, once they're taken over, have no logic behind them. But what's going to happen is, just like with everything else we talked about on this call and many other D-class calls, the white hats are going to go and go, thank you for building out blockade. Now we know that you have this list in place. And then whatever these names are on there, whether it's wallets, like accounts, or KYC or whatever over there, as soon as you open up a new wallet, it's going to automatically blacklist that wallet too. Thank you for doing all the legwork for us. Because in the future, after we arrest you, we'll just IBM ZOS the crap out of your code. We'll prettier.js your code, turn it into our code, and then apply that same to you. So they don't have to build this framework. They can just take over their framework. So I'm laughing because all of these cockroaches who are out there calling us scammers going, ha, here's evidence. They talked about you at Meridian. They have now just screwed themselves over. So my final thought on this is, there's that phrase, like, behind every successful man is a strong woman. I'm sure you guys have all heard this term before. I'm now thinking behind every successful black hat operation, in quotes, is an even sneakier, even gigglier white hat operation. Because the white hats think they've won, but actually they're just hanging themselves. The white hats have trapped them. And not only have they trapped them, but they're now logging through all of this coding that we've just talked about on this call. They're logging and tracking all of the shenanigans that they've been doing, and they're feeding them more rope going, hey, go for it, do it. Because all of this is going into our evidence locker, and all this is going to go into the future D class. So we're going to be able to prove to humanity exactly what you've done, because we set up all the coding, like the programming language and the life logging and the social media bridges, everything that you're doing like publicly to people and everything that you're doing sneakily in private comms to people, it's all getting logged by us because we wrote the darn codes for it. So anything that the black hats broke, the white hats can fix. Any person or creature, being, animal that the black hats injured or they killed, well, the white hats, they can heal and they can resurrect through the med beds. Any damage that the black hats created, the white hats can restore. So it tells you over and over again, the white hats and God is in control, and they're way more powerful than any demon or demon army of idiotic minions with their stupid cockroaches. So again, guys, it's more proof that nothing can stop what's happening. Nothing can stop it because the white hats are in control of literally every single thing. So thank you guys so much for being a part of this call. I hope you enjoyed our D class, and we will see you guys back in chat.